So now the cost of migration has gone up, but if the benefit is still high, this will not deter the migration overall. They will just be willing to pay a higher cost to reach the European Union.
Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work conducts research into significant and global challenges to the economy, society, and the welfare state. My name is Tim Phillips, and I'm visiting RFBerlin to find out what its researchers have been doing and why it matters to all of us. What drives migrants to make the decision to leave their lives behind and make a journey that might be expensive and dangerous? Or, put another way, what do they know and not know about the risks and rewards of migration? If we understood the answers to those questions better, could we make better policy around migration? Or what effect would those policies have on the flow of migrants into Europe? The work of Tommaso Frattini and Giacomo Battiston has tried to find answers at both ends of the migration journey. I spoke to them about what would-be migrants believe and how policymakers could respond. Giacomo, hello.
Hello.
And Tommaso, hi.
Hi, Tim.
Giacomo, when we're thinking about the decision to migrate, I guess anyone who does make that decision to migrate must weigh the costs and the benefits of doing it. What would they consider as the costs?
Yeah, certainly. That's exactly how economists would think about migration.
That's exactly how economists would think
and everything else, right? When we think about the costs of migration, I guess what people will take into consideration will be both financial costs, the cost of moving, the money you have to pay for, plane tickets for regular migration, but also to pay the smuggler in case of irregular migration.
Yes.
And these costs can be pretty high. Just thinking about irregular migration to Europe, if you come from Asia, say from Bangladesh, you can spend more than $5,000 based on survey data to get all the way to Italy. So these cost items can be pretty large depending on where you come from and which conditions you want to travel. But these are not the only costs migrants need to pay. Other costs are certainly not financial, and these include the risks that migrants have to go through when they try to cross irregularly from, say, West Africa to Europe. These costs can include the risk of being trafficked or experiencing violence along their journey. This type of things are pervasive in this environment. So when we think about migrants going from Africa to Europe, 70% of them report having experienced violence directly.
Wow.
Yeah. And 60% of them report having experienced being held against their will at some point during the journey.
More than 300 migrants from Iraq's Kurdistan region hoping to reach the United Kingdom were allegedly kidnapped in Libya, held in inhumane conditions, and forced to pay thousands of dollars in ransom. Some victims claimed they were threatened with the removal of their kidneys if their families failed to pay.
So if the costs are so high, then what benefits are they considering?
That's what an economist will say again, right? And for sure, in theory, the potential benefits of migration are pretty high. When you come from a country in West Africa and potentially you get the ability of integrating in the European labor market, you're facing extremely high wage differentials. And that's certainly a good motivation for people. Now, the question is, do these wage differentials actually emerge? And that's more complicated because there are many ways this cannot go well, let's say. One of them is there are many obstacles and restrictions to the ability of irregular migrants to actually work in European labor markets. But there are all sorts of other obstacles to labor market integration of this type of migrants, which make for pretty disappointing labor market integration outcomes, at least in the first years since arrival.
You did research specifically into this, how well potential migrants do understand the costs and benefits, and how accurate what they consider them to be is from what we know.
Yeah, that is true. I conducted research with Lucia Corno and Eliana La Ferrara of what is now an RFBerlin working paper, where we asked about potential migrants, high school students in Guinea, what is their perception of the benefits of and cost of migration, delving into very specific items relating to these things. Migrants tend to be quite optimistic compared to the averages, say, when it comes to the costs of migration. So those risks that I was mentioning before, violence, trafficking, and so on. Sometimes they are also optimistic about the economic opportunities that they find in Europe. When you give them information, they tend to change their mind and become more pessimistic. So what we claim is that this is indirect evidence that they are misinformed, because when you show them figures, they actually change their mind, and also they become less willing to migrate.
It's interesting to us to consider how potential migrants think about the decision to migrate. Is this something that policymakers who are thinking about migration consider, or are they really just focused on enforcement?
I guess these are two sides of the same thing. Policymakers are actually aware that migrants make this benefit-cost analysis, at least unconsciously, or it doesn't have to be, sitting down with a sheet of paper,
yes.
And what they try to do when they want to deter migration is to either reduce the benefits by, say, restricting your ability to work in another country more, or increasing the costs by making it harder to get a visa, or increasing enforcement. No, I think they're pretty aware of that.
The cost-benefit calculation is somewhat different if you're a migrant who is coming to escape conflict or persecution, for example. If you are making that type of migration, basically, does your cost-benefit analysis mean, well, you're coming whatever?
You could put it that way. So when you consider costs, there are non-financial and financial costs. And when you consider gains, there are non-financial and financial gains. And obviously, financial gains is getting a higher wage. Non-financial gains is also being in an environment where you are not at risk, where you can live without being at risk due to war, conflict around you. So yeah, that's definitely something that migrants factor in.
Tommaso, in your research, you have done analysis of border enforcement around the European Union and how much budget is given to that enforcement and how that budget is spent and whether indeed it works. How much does an increase in budget for enforcement on a route into the EU, how much does it affect migration through that route?
As we were discussing, basically, the idea behind any border enforcement policy is precisely to increase the cost of migration, right? If you take this benefit cost calculation that migrants do, the purpose of border enforcement is to increase the cost of irregularly crossing the border and thus to deter migrants from actually migrating. And this is a policy area that's attracted an increasing amount of resources over time, although it's very hard to precisely quantify the amount of resources that it attracts because border enforcement comes in many different ways and it's performed by many different agencies across countries. So to precisely quantify the amount is a daunting task in itself. But certainly also if you look at how the funding for Frontex, the European Border and Coast Guard Agency, has increased over time, this is a testimony to the fact that policymakers are increasingly devoting attention to border enforcement. So now coming to your question, does border enforcement work? Theory tells us it should, right? It increases the cost of migration and therefore it decreases the net gain for migration. What we see in our paper is that indeed, when border enforcement on a certain migratory route is increased, the number of migrants choosing that specific migratory route does go down. Okay, that's what you would expect.
That's what you would expect, and that would be considered a success.
It would be considered a success. It is, to some extent, a success.
Yes.
The question is, what happens to those potential migrants, those missing migrants who have not migrated along the route where they would have otherwise migrated in the absence of enforcement? And what happens is that some may decide not to migrate at all, but others might find it still more convenient to choose alternative routes to enter Europe. Okay, so Europe has multiple borders, multiple tracts of borders that are subject to the control of different countries, and many migrants might still find it profitable from a cost-benefit analysis point of view to choose a longer, more expensive migratory route and make their way to Europe through another way. A prominent example of this is what happened after the EU-Turkey deal that the EU signed with Turkey following the refugee crisis in 2015, right? So following that deal, the Turkish government, in accordance with the EU, essentially sealed down what we call the Eastern Mediterranean migratory route and did not allow anyone to actually enter the European Union through Turkey through Greece. Within a matter of a few months, many Asian migrants who were predominantly using that route materialized on the Central Mediterranean route. They were not using before that. And the Central Mediterranean route is pretty far away from the Eastern Mediterranean route. So this shows you how migratory routes evolve in response to enforcement policies and shows you that some of these border enforcement policies might simply have the effect of moving migrants from one migratory route to another, and so moving flows from their original destination to alternative destinations.
Does this mean then that we might be reporting success, as in each individual policy during the time that's operating appears successful, but in the aggregate, there's no change?
Yeah, it might be. That is, in fact, what in part happens. And it is also partly the result of the fact that although the European Union is one single entity, it is made of different countries who have different interests. So the fact that you are reducing migratory pressure at the Greek border might be a success for Greece, and the fact that it is increasing on the Central Mediterranean route, and therefore the number of people arriving in Italy or in Malta is increasing, is something that the Greek authorities may not care so much about.
One thing that comes through this is it's very obvious information is getting back to potential migrants about those changes in enforcement. What do we know about what they know about the network of routes that are available to them and the choices they have?
Well, it's hard to know exactly what they know.
Yes.
I can tell you what we can observe in the data, right? So what you observe in the data is that in response to policy measures, the size of flows and the direction of flows does actually change. The example that I just gave you is Asian migrants who are predominantly using the Eastern Mediterranean route. When that route is no longer available, some of them, many of them, choose alternative routes. They redo their calculations. So now the cost of migration has gone up, but if the benefit is still high, this will not deter their migration overall. They will just be willing to pay a higher cost to reach the European Union.
So I would imagine that the most popular routes to migrate would be, obviously, the safest ones, because, Giacomo, there is a very high probability of experiencing violence during your migration. If we are just diverting flows using enforcement rather than changing the aggregate number of migrants, are we just making migration more dangerous?
Yeah, in principle, that could be true. But obviously, as always, the best answer is it depends.
Yeah.
Right? As Tommaso was pointing out, these policies have two types of effects. One is diversion, but there's also deterrence. The question is, do these policies reduce the number of people traveling from their home country enough that they also reduce the number of people in peril? And this is a very hard question to answer. If you think about the example that Tommaso was mentioning before, people going through the Eastern Mediterranean route were probably facing a less unsafe environment than people traveling through the Central Mediterranean route, which is notoriously very dangerous. In balance, you may have that the people who are now traveling through the new route are less than the people who will have been traveling on the previous Eastern Mediterranean route. So the composition of that will actually determine whether you have more people in danger now.
As long as migrants perceive that the benefits of migration are high enough, increasing the cost of migration might not be sufficient measure to actually make them change their mind about the migration idea overall. They would take longer, more perilous route that certainly decrease their overall benefit of migration because it increases the cost of migration, but they may decide to migrate anyways. And the increased cost of migration comes from the fact that the journey will be longer, it will be more expensive, and it will also entail possibly higher risk of violence or even of death.
We have to accept that many migrants die. Does this mean that tougher enforcement policy is effectively tolerating the death of migrants as a price worth paying, although I'm sure policymakers aren't going to express it in those terms?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say there is a trade-off between deterrence and safety when it comes to border enforcement on very dangerous passages like crossing the Mediterranean. Policymakers are pretty conscious of that, and they act on this trade-off by trying to strike a balance that is politically feasible. That's why you have seen rescue operations being curtailed for migrants coming from Libya, or operations restricting the availability of NGO rescue for migrants trying to cross.
For policy, you've already hinted at this. Instead of this focus on enforcement that dominates the news, it dominates the political discourse, could making sure that potential migrants just have better information about what the benefits and the costs of migrating are, would this reduce flows, do you think?
There is experimental evidence showing what are the impacts of information campaigns, but now you're asking, what if we now bring these campaigns to full scale and we have some big information campaign for people from a given country or region? It's hard for me to think that this policy will be effective because there will be a self-interest in who is giving the information, which would probably make people very quickly skeptical about the content.
They would say that, wouldn't they?
That's, again, speculation. We have no research on this that I know, at least. But yeah, that's why I'm skeptical of this.
And also, there is something that we should not forget, that there is an intergenerational dimension to the decision to migrate. So by migrating, you might also accept that you're taking some risk and possibly going through some hardships in your first years upon arrival in host country. So maybe you also know that your life in the host country, once you make it, will not be as rosy as you would hope, but you're still thinking that may be a price worth paying to make the lives of your children better. So that is a very, I think, powerful reason why people may be willing to accept dire conditions upon migration.
If I can add to that, and I think this is a very important point, there are many trade-offs here. And one trade-off is enduring hardships now in order to get benefits later. That's why economists see migration as an investment. You bear the cost now, you get the benefits later. What is very hard about understanding the effects of policies, but also things like conflict happening in this type of situations, is that the migration journeys and then the investment migrants make evolve over time. And that's the main project I'm working on at RFBerlin. When it comes to migration decisions, what we are actually seeing in this context is a sequence of migration decisions from one country to the other that, by making you pass through transit countries, in the end may let you arrive in Europe, if that's your final decision. So any policy that tries to affect the cost of migration will also make all these interconnected decisions change. And that's going to have a very complex effect in the end on the migration decision of the individual from the home country.
The worth of the research that you do at RFBerlin is partly in the attention that it gets from policymakers. Both of your research says some challenging things for policymakers. Are they prepared to listen?
Well, I'm not sure whether they're prepared or not, but it might be worth reflecting on what's the return of every euro or dollar or pound spent on border enforcement policies versus the equivalent amount being spent on other types of policies. Bringing to the attention of policymakers the cost effectiveness of the policies that are implemented is something worth doing, regardless of whether we agree or disagree with the ultimate goal of the policy. You might have some policy goal in mind that I may disagree with, but the question is whether the policy you're implementing is cost effective anyways to reach the goal that you are aiming to reach, or whether you could perhaps achieve the same goal in a better way or target some other goal that may deliver the same ultimate result. If you wanted to deter migration because you think that this makes the population of your country better off, but deterring migration might be very expensive or very hard, you might decide to make the population of your country better off by spending the same amount of money on other policies that have a higher return on increasing the welfare of the population.
These are important questions, so let's hope the policymakers are listening. Thank you very much, Giacomo.
Thank you.
And Tommaso.
Thank you, Tim.
There are several research papers for this one. First of all, Securing European Borders, Enforcement, Politics and Externalization. Authors Francesco Fasani and Tommaso Frattini. Informing Risky Migration, Evidence from a Field Experiment in Guinea. Authors Giacomo Battiston, Lucia Corno and Eliano Laferrara. Rescue on Stage, Border Enforcement and Public Attention in the Mediterranean Sea. Author Giacomo Battiston. You will find more information and further research about this at RFBerlin. Go to rfberlin.com.